On July 31st, 2021, I had no idea who Chris Chan was. Despite indulging in some degenerate internet culture, I lived in a world devoid of sonnetu. The next day, that all changed when I came across a thread on Reddit about the recent news that Chris Chan, now known as Christine Chandler, a transgender woman, had raped her own elderly mother. I relayed this information to one of my close friends via Discord, and I've put these messages on screen. I'll be using my Discord messages to my friend throughout this video, as it paints a picture of my changing views on the subject of transgender rights. Also, just to add that for clarity's sake, I will use people's preferred pronouns throughout this video. So, the details about Christine Chan's situation were unclear, and updates kept pouring in. I couldn't stop reading. How could something like this even happen? What makes a person do this? Luckily for me, there's a 59-part documentary that details Christine's life from when they first captured the collective eye of the internet with their original creation, sonnetu. I started writing a brief overview of Christine Chandler's life, a life that is so highly documented that certain periods have been split into sagas by Christorians, but it's really immaterial to what I want to discuss in this video. I'm not going to argue whether Christine is transgender or not. Instead, I will detail my evolving thought process on transgender rights using Christine Chandler's arrest as a jumping-off point. So, when Christine was taken into custody on the 2nd of August, and I saw that their gender was down as female, it definitely struck a nerve that someone with a penis could be jailed with women. I knew that, obviously, Christine was not emblematic of all trans women, and Christine is very much an outlier in the terms of the whole of humanity. In fact, I stated my concern in my Discord logs. I was scared that Christine would be used by the TERFs to set back trans rights. At the same time, I just couldn't shake that Chris had been arrested as a woman, and people were falling over themselves to correct others when they were being misgendered as male. I just couldn't let it go, and I decided to educate myself on what it means to be a trans woman, and by that extension, a woman. So, first of all, I think it's worth noting my own stance on transgender rights at the time of Christine's arrest, so you can see where I'm coming from. I was firmly of the opinion that trans women are women, and that TERFs were bigoted in stating that they were not. After all, who was I to gatekeep femininity or womanhood? Come to think of it, what even is womanhood? Or even still, what makes me a woman? I just wanted people to be happy, and as cliche as it sounds, live their truth. Transgender people were just like me, just wanted to get on with life and do their own thing. My actual understanding of TERF arguments was limited. I knew what the acronym stood for, trans excluding radical feminists, and my basic understanding was, it's in the name. They exclude trans women from the feminist discourse and do not view trans women as women. Whilst this is correct, it's not particularly nuanced, but what I had taken from social media was that TERFs equals bad. In terms of my relationship with feminism, well, I would definitely say I was a feminist, but to my mind, on all big issues, we had won. Yeah, sure, things could be better, but I felt like I had all the freedoms men had. If you had asked me the biggest issue that women still faced, I probably would have said something like women with children being expected to work like they had no children and parent like they had no job. Something which I had seen firsthand by observing my female colleagues. However, I was much more concerned with the generational differences in the distribution of wealth and work expectations. I am a younger millennial, after all. When it comes to expressing my political thoughts on social media, well, whilst I have a Twitter, Reddit, and Instagram, and I use them regularly, I just don't get into any discussions about politics or issues online. I am opinionated, but I have these discussions in real life. I don't see the point of screaming into the void of the internet. My online life is dedicated to memes and dog influencers. However, even though I don't engage in the online political discourse, I do follow it, and trans issues are unavoidable. In my offline life, trans issues came up from time to time with my older family members. They would express their concerns about the premise of being transgender, as well as the new language that had emerged. I wouldn't go so far as to call them bigoted, but I was firmly of the persuasion that they were wrong. I would become quite emotional defending trans rights. My go-to lines of defense were 1. Sex is a spectrum. 2. Gender is just a social construct. And 3. The discourse of transgender rights is the same as gay rights 20 years ago. I had gleaned these arguments from online leftist progressives, the main one being Hassan Piker via Twitch. I agreed broadly with Hassan's politics. We do differ on some major points, but I took him to be in a good faith source, I guess. I was also familiar with ContraPoints, and I had watched her videos Gender Critical and J.K. Rowling. Alright, so that's a brief overview of my background when it comes to trans rights. Looking back, it seems what really helped me cement this position was my natural compassion, and the fact that I just wanted to make people happy. Right, now we're ready to tackle the thought that threatened this belief. So, I have already mentioned that it was being labeled as female under gender when Christine was processed for custody, which tipped me off to thinking something wasn't quite right. So let's revisit that. So where I am, in the UK, in order to be recognized as the gender other than the one assigned to you at birth, you need to obtain a gender recognition certificate. This requires that you have a diagnosis of dysphoria, lived as your acquired gender for at least 2 years, and that you are over 18. The ability for trans people in the UK to self-ID as their chosen gender without a medical diagnosis was ruled out as of September 2020. I think it is worth noting that when the government was consulting about whether to change the law, they asked various trans rights groups, as well as other stakeholders, and of the 102,818 responses received, 64% said that there should not be a requirement for a diagnosis of gender dysphoria in the future, on the grounds that being trans was neither a medical nor a mental health issue. Okay, so being trans isn't a medical or mental health issue. I needed a further explanation on what being trans is, so I read further and found in the qualitative section from the same report the following response which expands on this very point. Gender labels are forcibly applied to children at birth, and the idea that somebody has to go through a complex psychological evaluation in order to change their label is a violation of our dignity. Gender is not a choice, but it is a matter of personal identity. Doctors and psychologists should not be allowed to gatekeep this process. Gender being an identity and being independent of a person's sex is not how we have traditionally thought of gender, but is the separation that is at the heart of gender ideology and the transgender experience. You may be born male or female, but being a woman is a form of identity. I then asked myself, how would I characterize my gender? What made me a woman? I honestly could not cut the cord between my sex and my gender. Whilst I'm obviously not just a walking uterus, to me my sex informs my gender, and therefore my gender was composed of my sexual organs, my socialization as female, and issues I would face as a direct result of my sex. I did think about adding how well I conform to society's expectations of a woman, rating my femininity on a scale of 1 to 10, but as soon as I started to do this, I realized, hey, these are just stereotypes. I obviously don't predicate being a woman on whether I'm playing video games or sewing a fashionable bib for my dog. I just am a woman. Conversely, I then also asked myself, how did I know I wasn't a man? And going back to my definition, yeah, I fulfilled none of the criteria. Delving into the existential level, I also couldn't imagine what it feels like to be a man, because, well, how could I? Going back to gender ideology, well, they would argue that what I identified as making me a woman actually does not. Sex has nothing to do with gender, neither do my experiences. When it comes down to it, for gender ideologues, it is enough to feel like a woman, to be one. Okay, for argument's sake, I will accept that it's possible to know what being a woman feels like without any female sex characteristics or lived experience. So, if there was such a thing as a woman essence trapped in a male body, then I would expect men who identified as women to have similar behavioural patterns. This brings us to bathrooms. I would roll my eyes whenever the bathroom debate came up. I mean, we all piss, am I right? But let's widen the subject to same-sex spaces. Same-sex spaces are a direct result of first-wave feminism, the acknowledgement that men and women are different, and during our most intimate or private moments, there is a need or desire to feel safe amongst one's own sex. There is no protective force field that will cause people with penises to disintegrate as soon as they try and enter a female space. However, what does exist is societal pressure, as well as knowing that you have the right to challenge someone when you are feeling threatened. If you are stood there working out whether or not you may be hurting someone's feelings because they are registering as male to you, or if they are indeed an actual threat, well, those are seconds where you could be escaping or defending yourself. Of course, not all men, and not all transgender women, are just looking to commit a sexual offense at any opportune moment. But at the same time, we must acknowledge that there are fundamental differences between males and females when it comes to offending and criminality. The fact that males account for 98% of rape flag convictions by the Crown Prosecution Service cannot be dismissed. The UK government's Women and Equalities Committee recently asked for evidence on trans women's offending rates and whether they were comparable to cis women's offending rates. The evidence given cites this Swedish study, who found that for trans women who had gone through sex reassignment surgery as well as hormone therapy, male to female transitioners were over 6 times more likely to be convicted of an offense than a female comparator, and 18 times more likely to be convicted of a violent offense. The group had no statistically significant differences from other natal males, or for convictions in general, or for violent offending. Essentially, after transitioning, trans women keep their male pattern of criminality. They are behaviorally male. But gender ideology asks of us to discount that fact, as well as deny our instincts when it comes to the following scenarios. Someone with a penis tailgating a woman into a female-only space. Someone with a penis undressing in a female or child-only space. Women in prison who are given condoms because there are women with penises joining the population. Lesbians being told they have to accept women with penises as a dating option. When I actually sat down and thought about these scenarios, I just couldn't square that you could be a woman and still have a penis. It required a transcendence of the physical form that I simply don't have. We only have guesstimates when it comes to how many trans women have sex reassignment surgery. Fair Play for Women extrapolate from data from the US would mean that 0.1% of the trans community undergoes genital surgery each year, supporting our conclusion that the vast majority of males who identify as women retain their penis. Additionally, 2.8% of the transgender community is undergoing any gender-affirming treatment, with the vast majority, 97.2%, simply self-identify with no modifications to their sex body whatsoever. So, in reality, the majority of transgender women are simply self-IDing as women and calling it a day, which was at odds to what I had previously thought. On the 8th of August, I began to lay out my counterpoints to my Discord friend about my previously held belief that trans women were women. For me, what has rattled me is that if anyone can self-ID as a woman, then what it means to be a woman doesn't matter. And the protections that I currently enjoy don't matter. I always scoffed at the bathroom debate, a guy going through all that trouble to identify as a woman to rape women. I thought no one is going to do that. But trans women have exactly the same offending rate as cis men. I never looked at it before. I always took it in good faith that wouldn't happen, lol. And I thought that people who transitioned would have sex reassignment surgery. But the figures are that only 5% do, which I honestly completely understand. To be honest, it sounds grueling. And I'm just like, if I'm in the changing room and I see a woman with a dick, I'm to accept that that's being a woman? And I'm circling back to not wanting to mean any harm. I go on to worry that maybe I've been J.K. Rowling and I've fallen to Graham Lineham levels of depravity. But I'm coming to the realization that me wanting to protect same-sex spaces and acknowledging that trans women are women is incongruous. I'm still not in TERFdom just yet, but my view on the validity of a man being able to self-ID as a woman is definitely dissipating. I guess I'm true scum at this point, or a transmedicalist. True scum are people who believe that you are only transgender if you experience gender dysphoria. So, let's take a look at dysphoria. Dysphoria is the intense feeling of unease and uncomfortableness someone feels with their assigned sex and their body. I actually have a lot of empathy with someone who feels great distress just by being in their own skin. I was bulimic for 7 years, and my self-worth was directly tied to how I looked, which in a way mirrors how transgender women are fixated on their perceived femininity by others as validation. My self-image was so fragile that when I was at university, I would decline invitations to go out in case I would be photographed. I would feel extreme anxiety if I saw any past pictures of myself, and I would try and erase my past self as much as I could. It was shameful to me. From reading a lot of first-hand accounts via trans subreddits, I could see a lot of parallels. I used to live in a I'll be happy when I'm thin mindset. All of my problems were tied to my weight, and any redeeming qualities I did have were worthless. The type of body I envied was the willowy, slight, waif-like figure of 90s supermodels. I thought having that type of body would make me happy. Going along with what people think will make them happy is not always what's best for them. No good health professional was going to tell my past bulimic self that what I actually needed to do was stop eating altogether, as that will eventually make me thin and happy. Furthermore, even if I did get to that target weight, I still wouldn't have the body I dreamt of. I cannot circumvent my genetics, my biology. I'm just built different. I have wide shoulders and hips, and even when I'm exercising or lifting weights and eating healthily, I start to develop quads like Chris Hoy. That's just how it is, and I'm honestly cool with it now, but it did take a lot of work to get there. I don't want to be intentionally derogatory, but even when trans women do have sex reassignment surgery and hormones, they still won't have the same experience as biological females. It's going to be fundamentally different. If you go to any trans-based subreddit, I'm using r/MTF for example, you will find that it's not just passing or being misgendered that are sources of dysphoria, but also biological female functions, periods, reproduction, breastfeeding. I think if you are having extreme anxiety over something that you will never achieve because it's at odds with your fundamental genetics, just like me and my past desire to have a tiny frame, then you need to seek therapy rather than surgical intervention. But this very notion would be dismissed as invalidating a trans person's identity. The most often cited study that examines what happens after sex reassignment surgery is the Swedish study from 2011. This study looked at 324 transsexual people who underwent sex reassignment surgery and were assigned a new legal sex between 1973 and 2003. The main findings of the study on suicide are: 1. Overall, the suicide rate of trans people is near 20 times higher than that of cisgendered people after sex reassignment surgery. 2. Survival of transsexual persons started to diverge from that of match controls after about 10 years of follow-up. Mortality from suicide was much higher in sex reassigned persons compared to match controls. 3. Male to females are at higher risk from suicide attempts after sex reassignment, whereas female to males maintain a female pattern of suicide attempts after sex reassignment. The study also makes it clear that the results should not be interpreted such as sex reassignment per se increases morbidity and mortality. Things might have been even worse without sex reassignment. The study suggests that mortality rates are so different from their control groups due to transsexual individuals had been hospitalized for psychiatric morbidity other than gender identity disorder prior to sex reassignment about 4 times more often than controls. To follow up on this point of psychiatric disorders, another study in 2020 looked at 37 studies published in the last 5 years and focused on the prevalence of various psychiatric pathologies. They found that in up to 58 to 71% of the cases, we could find a psychiatric diagnosis, the most frequent pathologies being depression, with prevalence of up to 50%, self-harm 8%, and anxiety 37.2%. These pathologies have a prevalence 2 to 3 times higher than in the non-transgender population. Their research also noted that autism spectrum disorders may be a factor, especially when it comes to female-to-male transitions. A recent study, and the largest of its kind, examined this very premise and found the 5 datasets together include 641,860 people, mostly adults. 30,892 have autism, and 3,777 identify as gender diverse. About 30,000, or 5% of the cisgender people in the study have autism, the researchers found, whereas 895, or 24% of the gender diverse people do. I know that I have just gone through and thrown a lot of data and direct quotes from studies at you there, but when I was reading through the literature, it became clear that underlying psychiatric conditions were prevalent in the trans population. These are vulnerable people who I would argue are not getting the therapeutic help that they require. At the end of the day, there is no negative feedback loop when it comes to determining whether you are trans or not. No mental health help is offered, as this may be viewed as antagonistic and invalidating identity-wise. Due to the "if you feel like a woman, you are one" definition of woman, there is no objective criteria to satisfy. People often post on r/MTF to ask whether they are trans or not, and are always weighed through, even though there may be other mental health variables at work. Even at this point, I wanted more answers about identity, or being openly trans, so I went back to YouTube to look up what trans women say about identity, and what it means to be a woman. I seemingly found the perfect video. PhilosophyTube, who is part of BreadTube, the leftist YouTube glitterati, had a video about coming out as a transgender woman. Great, now I can finally get some answers.
Alas, I can't be a perfect paragon of trans Britain. I'm just an actress. But I can relay the following facts. Trans people have existed for as long as there has been a Britain. Longer. But even after a century of feminism, the government still dictates what we can do with our own bodies. The NHS is forced by outdated rules to discriminate against us. If a cisgender, that is, not trans, woman, wants hormone replacement therapy for menopause, she can get it from the GP. But if a trans person needs the same medicine to transition, we are forced to travel to a separate clinic and be interrogated by psychiatrists. Because of this discrimination, waiting lists are years long. Women like me die waiting for the exact same medicine that bald men get from the GP to treat hair loss. Trans men die waiting for breast reduction surgery that cis women get for back pain. In England and Wales, people under 16 can get an abortion, which is permanent, but they can't get life-saving puberty blockers, which are reversible.
I will briefly unpack their rhetoric. 1. There has not been trans people all throughout history. Intersex or not conforming to gender roles, yes, but not trans. 2. Feminism has nothing to do with being transgender. It is about protecting sex-based rights and acknowledging the differences between men and women. 3. Cisgender women getting hormones for menopause has different considerations because their biology is fundamentally different than someone born male. It makes sense that there are separate routes. 4. An extremely misogynistic argument. An abortion is only permanent if you're accounting the fetus's well-being before the mother's. And 5. Puberty blockers are not reversible. As much as I disagree with what Philosophy Tube is saying, I was actually struck more by the manner in which they said it. I slowly came to recognize the condescending tone, the obliviousness, the audacity. I've experienced this before. I was being mansplained to. This is an overarching theme in the transgender discourse. You'll find that when women do speak against trans rights, they are met with stereotypical male entitlement and aggression. Women do not behave like this. Just look at any Twitter thread where a woman is standing up for her sex-based rights and count the rape threats. Again, women do not behave like this. Furthermore, this behavior is not isolated, it is pervasive. Alright, so, bit of a subject change. I'm not going to focus much on this area, but I think it is worth acknowledging. In my journey through reading the r/MTF subreddit threads about gender dysphoria, I kept running into the mention of sissy or forced feminization porn. I literally had no idea what that was. So, sissy porn features men who are forced to wear highly sexualized female clothing and are then degraded. I'm not going to say much more than this because it gets graphic really quickly, but essentially the men are forced into becoming full-blown bimbos, empty-headed, submissive, and subhuman. There is also a next level to this kind of porn, hypno-sissy porn, where there is a reprogramming hypnotic element added to the central premise. There are distinct differences when it comes to men and women and their porn use, both when it comes to frequency and material. You can argue about the wage gap all you want, but there is definitely a porn gap when it comes to men and women. I actually found very few quantitative studies about women and what material they do use. I saw the Pornhub stats, but nothing more than this. I'm going to go out on a limb here, though, and say that women are not watching sissy porn. I honestly couldn't believe that people were essentially asking, does this highly misogynistic porn that no woman would ever watch make me a woman? I was hesitant to include this section, but it was one of the things I came across which challenged my views on trans ideology. It also does come up as a reason why men feel like they are women. After going over everything, the scales had finally fallen from my eyes. I realized, to put it bluntly, that transsexual women were actually just men. I kept going over it in my head. I was now on the other side. The side with Tucker Carlson and Ben Shapiro, but also on the side of J.K. Rowling and my parents. In the eyes of many progressives, I'm holding a bigoted position. I know I'm not bigoted. If you somehow had a camera in my room and could see me scrolling through Reddit, you would definitely see the exact moment I became gender critical going by my facial expressions. I remember sitting there at my computer desk at 3 a.m. and realizing, oh fuck, I'm a TERF. I felt so many things after reaching this conclusion. One of the surprising things I felt was anger. I say this as I rarely get angry. I was angry that my understanding and compassion had been taken advantage of. Angry because I, and so many other women, have effectively been silenced. If I expressed my views on social media, or on any forum really, it would be seen as hate speech, and I would be unable to secure or keep a job. Just like there is new language around trans issues, there is also new language on the gender critical side. I found out that what I had just experienced, going from trans right advocate to being gender critical, was called peaking. Peaking is when you realize that your female sex-based rights are actually being eroded, and that trans women were not widening the experiences of womanhood. Instead, they were a subset of men. A subset of men who had given themselves more rights, as well as righteousness when it comes to women's issues. The right to encroach on female-only spaces. The righteousness to ask female rape victims to reframe their trauma so that a transgender woman can become CEO of a rape crisis center. The right to compete in women's sports. The right to push medical intervention on healthily bodied people. The righteousness to form a bastardized version of womanhood, complete with the fetishization of periods, breastfeeding, and female sexuality. After coming to the gender-critical conclusion, I decided to tell my parents about my change of mind. I felt like I needed to apologize, even though I hadn't gone as far to call them bigots when we discussed trans rights issues. I definitely did feel that way at the time. I acknowledged their concerns were valid, and that I had come to the same conclusion. I'm mentioning this because, for me, admitting I was wrong was easy to do. I didn't have a sprawling trail of tweets advocating for trans rights, and I'm not a public person who needs to always have a definitive stance. It was easy for me. I just had to walk back my position to the two most understanding people in the world. I do feel like we are pretty far down the path of trans rights being a given rather than a discussion. To me, the trans discourse has suffered majorly from power creep. We have gone from, there are two sexes, male and female, gender is based in sex. Sex is actually a spectrum. Sex has nothing to do with gender. Gender is a social construct, and is an identity. Because sex has nothing to do with gender, you do not need to experience dysphoria to change gender. Similarly, you do not need to have sex reassignment surgery to change gender. If you feel like a woman, then you are one, no questions asked. The identity of woman now essentially means nothing. Now we're at the point where even biological sex is up for debate. The further we go down this route, the harder it is for people to admit that they were wrong and that a person's sex actually does matter. Having the weight of science on your side has become obfuscated by progressive pandering, inclusion, and rabid individuality. Furthermore, due to trans rights now being a given, the only people who can speak up are those who are rich enough, powerful enough, or don't really rely on the social currency of public opinion. So far to date, no mainstream public figure has come out and said that trans women aren't women. Social media is the ultimate purity test, and the trans rights side of the debate is given a lot more clout, and if you stand against them, then you're just hateful. It's also really hard to delineate the arguments against transgender rights once you have gone through the entire process and come to the gender critical conclusion. It just becomes so obvious that, well, that's a man, baby. Furthermore, this is an emotional topic. I am an emotional person. Ironically, I felt the same quiver in my voice when I was defending trans rights as I do now when I've done a 180 and become gender critical. I hope you're ready for some misogynistic tough love, but you can have the best argument in the world, and if you are a shrill female, men and women alike will not listen to you. It is very hard not to be shrill and feel that emotion rising when you are a woman, having to explain how your sex-based rights are being eroded. Anger is useful, but not sustainable. What is needed is a clear head to dispassionately unpick all the rhetoric of trans rights activists. You have to also, to some extent, play by their rules, use their language, and argue in good faith. I think a good starting point is to ask what makes someone a man or a woman, and use empathy to understand their position. I hope it also goes without saying that I don't hate transgender people. I think that their dysphoria needs to be treated with therapy rather than surgery, and ultimately, as grandiose as it sounds, I would seek to abolish gender. It is hard to be gender non-conforming in this society, especially for males. Quite simply, there just aren't enough acceptable ways for men to express their femininity, or rather deviate from what's socially acceptable. Not just when it comes to clothing, but also in how to relate to others. However, I have not lost hope. In YouTubing my way through the transgender discourse, I found King Critical, who high-key restored my faith in male kind. The late Magdalene Burns, who is masterful when it comes to concisely picking apart the bullshit, and Lisa Michelle, whose pathway to being gender critical is not unlike mine, starting in compassion and understanding. I highly recommend all their channels, and I will link them down below. There are some great gender critical spaces left on the internet, you just have to seek them out. One of the surprising places I found great gender critical content is actually Tumblr. In looking for a way to finish off this video, I looked at suffragette quotes, and I came across the following from Christabel Pankhurst, Emmeline Pankhurst's daughter. Remember the dignity of your womanhood. Do not appeal, do not beg, do not grovel. Take courage, join hands, stand beside us, fight with us. I was drawn to this quote because right now trans right activists are asking women to acquiesce to the erosion of our rights. Women are often asked to bend to the will of others. I myself had forgotten the dignity of my womanhood by trying to accommodate trans women and just make everyone happy. I will never forget this again. I will not appeal to those who state that trans women are women. I will take courage and state that sex matters, and gender is grounded in biology. I will not beg for my rights to be respected, but join hands with other women who know how important these rights are. I will not grovel for defending my rights and being labelled a TERF. I will fight and clearly define what being a woman is, and why it is important. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you found this video thought-provoking at the very least. Do let me know what you think. I'm going to be making more videos around feminism and politics, so if you're interested you can subscribe. If not, then curse me, Yameha!